A simple woman told to play a broken piano as a joke, then her talent shocks the room. In the competitive world of New York City's elite musicians, Sarah Miller was invisible, a cleaner with calloused hands and no formal training. When prestigious pianists gathered for the annual Steinberg competition, elderly judge Eleanor Whitmore pointed her toward the abandoned piano in the corner, expecting humiliation. But when Sarah's fingers touched those keys, what happened next left the entire auditorium speechless. Sarah Miller wiped her brow with the back of her hand as she finished polishing the last of the gleaming grand pianos at the Manhattan Music Academy. The early morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the polished wooden floor. At 38, Sarah's once soft hands were now marked with calluses from years of cleaning the Academy's hallowed halls.
"All done for today, Mrs. Henderson?"
she called to the elderly receptionist, who sat guarding the entrance with fierce loyalty. "Thank you, dear. Don't forget they're setting up for the Steinberg competition tonight. Best to clear out before those musical prima donnas arrive." Sarah nodded, but didn't move toward the exit. Instead, her eyes drifted to the largest of the grand pianos, a magnificent Steinway that gleamed like black diamond under the chandeliers. When she was certain Mrs. Henderson had returned to her crossword puzzle, Sarah quietly slipped onto the bench. She didn't touch the keys at first, just sat there, hands hovering, remembering. Her mother had been a waitress at a jazz club in Brooklyn. After closing, when the floors were swept and the chairs stacked on tables, the pianist, an old man with eyes that crinkled when he smiled, would let 7-year-old Sarah explore the keyboard while her mother counted tips. "You've got it, little bird," he'd say. "Some people study music their whole lives and never find what you've got naturally." But then her mother got sick. Bills piled up. The piano lessons that kind strangers had arranged fell away. Life became about surviving, not dreaming. Sarah placed her fingers on the cool keys, careful not to press down. She'd been doing this for years, cleaning instruments she never played, polishing wood that vibrated with music she never made. "I didn't know the janitors played." Sarah jumped, nearly toppling the bench. A young man with kind eyes and a security guard's uniform stood in the doorway. I was just..." Sarah fumbled for words, embarrassed. "Hey, no judgment here." He raised his hands in surrender. "I'm Miguel, new night security." "Sarah." She stood quickly, smoothing her uniform. "I should go." "You don't have to." Miguel nodded toward the piano. "Play something?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't really play." Miguel's eyebrow arched skeptically. "Your hands say different." Sarah glanced down at her fingers, still curved as if ready to press down on invisible keys. "I never had lessons. Not really." She gathered her cleaning supplies. "Besides, instruments like these aren't for people like me." Miguel tilted his head. "And what kind of people are you?" The question hung in the air, simple yet piercing. Sarah had no answer that didn't sound like defeat. "Did you know," Miguel said, breaking the silence, "that the Steinberg competition this weekend has a wildcard spot, one slot for an unknown player?" "They're doing auditions tomorrow morning." Sarah laughed, the sound echoing in the empty hall. "Right, and I'll just walk in there in my cleaning uniform and ask to play against people who've been training since birth." "Why not?" Miguel's voice was soft but serious. "What's the worst that could happen? Humiliation? Ridicule? Confirmation of everything I've told myself for 20 years? Or," Miguel countered, "the opposite." As Sarah walked home to her small apartment in Queens that evening, Miguel's words followed her like a melody. Outside her building, she stopped to check her mail. Among the bills and flyers was a glossy pamphlet that must have been mixed in by mistake. An advertisement for the Steinberg competition, featuring photographs of previous winners. Their faces were confident, polished, belonging to a world Sarah had only glimpsed through windows she cleaned. But as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, her fingers tapped against the railing, playing an invisible sonata only she could hear. The next morning, Sarah found herself lingering after her shift, watching as the audition committee set up in the main recital hall. Contestants for the wildcard spot arrived in tailored outfits, carrying leather portfolios filled with sheet music. They spoke in confident tones about conservatories and international competitions, while Sarah shrank against the wall, still in her grey uniform. "You came." Miguel appeared beside her, his security uniform freshly pressed. Sarah shook her head. "I'm just watching. The sign-up sheet is over there." He nodded toward a table where a severe-looking woman with steel-grey hair checked names against a list. "Last chance. They're only taking the first 20 applicants. I don't have anything prepared. I don't have sheet music. I don't even have clothes that don't smell like cleaning products." Sarah's excuses tumbled out. Miguel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Registration form?" "I grabbed one earlier." "Miguel." "Look," he cut her off gently. "I heard you yesterday. You didn't know I was there, but I heard you playing when you thought everyone had left." Sarah's face flushed. "You were spying on me. I was doing my security rounds, and what I heard—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah, I've worked here 5 years. I've heard students who've trained their whole lives. What you played, it was different. It was amateur," she supplied. "Real," he corrected. "It was like you were having a conversation with the piano." A chime sounded, indicating the auditions would begin in 5 minutes. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as Miguel pressed the form into her hand. "You don't have to do this," he said, "but I think you'll regret it if you don't." Before she could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of distinguished-looking people entered, led by an elderly woman with immaculate white hair, pearl earrings, and a light beige suit jacket. Even Sarah recognized her. Eleanor Whitmore, the legendary pianist who had performed in concert halls around the world and now served as the competition's lead judge. The other committee members orbited around her like planets around a sun, nodding as she spoke and laughing at her remarks. Sarah watched as Eleanor surveyed the room with critical eyes, her gaze passing over the cleaning cart Sarah had abandoned. "Last call for wildcard auditions," announced the woman at the registration table. Something tightened in Sarah's chest. Not quite courage, but perhaps its quieter cousin. Defiance. Defiance against the voice that had told her for years that music wasn't for people who cleaned floors, that dreams were luxury items she couldn't afford. "Here," Sarah said, approaching the table and sliding her hastily completed form across the surface. "I'd like to audition." The woman looked up, her eyes widening slightly at Sarah's uniform before her professional mask slipped back into place. "Name?" "Sarah Miller." "And your piece?" Sarah hesitated. "It's original?" "Something I composed." This earned her a raised eyebrow. "The committee typically expects classical repertoire." "It's all I have," Sarah admitted. The woman sighed, making a notation on her clipboard. "Very well, you'll be last. Wait over there with the others." Sarah joined the group of contestants, painfully aware of how out of place she looked. Some stared openly, others whispered behind their hands. A young man in a crisp suit smirked. "I think you got the wrong room," he said, voice pitched to carry. "Custodial services is down the hall." Several others laughed, but Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the audition room door, counting the minutes until her turn. Either this would be one of the most embarrassing moments of her life, or... She didn't allow herself to complete the thought. Hope was a dangerous thing for people who had learned to live without it. The audition hall gradually emptied as contestants emerged, some jubilant, others fighting back tears. Sarah remained in her corner, watching as the young man who had mocked her earlier strode out with a triumphant smile. The committee was very impressed, he announced to no one in particular. Ms. Whitmore herself said my Chopin had exceptional emotional depth. Sarah's stomach tightened. She had heard him play through the door, technically flawless, but somehow mechanical, if that was what the judges wanted. Sarah Miller called the assistant, her tone suggesting she had repeated the name more than once. Rising on unsteady legs, Sarah entered the audition room. 3 judges sat at a long table, a middle-aged man with spectacles perched on his nose, a younger woman with a severe bun, and in the center, Eleanor Whitmore herself. Behind them, a small audience of music faculty, previous contestants, and competition staff observed. "Ms. Miller," Eleanor said, consulting her notes. "It says here you're performing an original composition." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor's perfectly penciled eyebrows arched. "And your musical background?" Sarah hesitated. "I'm self-taught." A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. The younger judge leaned over to whisper something to Eleanor, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I see," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "And you work here at the academy?" Heat rushed to Sarah's face. "I'm on the cleaning staff." More whispers, less discreet this time. Sarah caught fragments. "Is this a joke?" "And waste of time." Eleanor studied Sarah for a long moment, then gestured toward the gleaming grand piano at the center of the room. "Well, Ms. Miller, please proceed." "Please." Sarah approached the instrument, its polished surface reflecting the overhead lights like a mirror. This was the Academy's pride, a concert grand used only for the most prestigious performances. She sat on the bench, adjusting her position, aware of every eye in the room watching her, anticipating failure. As she raised her hands, Eleanor cleared her throat. "Actually, Ms. Miller," she said, voice honeyed with false concern, "perhaps that instrument isn't quite appropriate for this audition." The male judge frowned. "Eleanor." But Eleanor continued, "I believe there's another piano that might be better suited." She pointed to the far corner of the room where an old upright piano stood, its wooden case dulled with age. "That one hasn't been tuned for the competition. It would be more forgiving for an amateur performance." The implication was clear. Eleanor didn't consider Sarah worthy of the grand piano. Sarah felt dozens of eyes on her, waiting for her reaction, expecting embarrassment or anger. Instead, she stood calmly and walked to the upright piano. She had played far worse instruments during her childhood, out-of-tune pianos in community centers, electronic keyboards with missing keys. The bench creaked as she sat. Up close, she could see the piano's flaws, chipped keys, worn pedals, a faded fallboard. She pressed middle C, wincing at the slightly flat tone. This wasn't just old, it was deliberately neglected. "I'm afraid that one hasn't been serviced in quite some time," Eleanor said, not bothering to hide her smirk now. "If it's too challenging, you're welcome to withdraw your application." The younger judge looked uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should—" "No," Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her steadiness. This piano was fine. Eleanor's smile tightened. "As you wish. Whenever you're ready." Sarah placed her hands on the keyboard, feeling the uneven resistance of the keys beneath her fingers. In the silence of the room, she could hear faint snickering from the back row. She closed her eyes, shutting out the judgmental stares and knowing smiles. For a moment, she was back in that Brooklyn jazz club, a child discovering music for the first time before life had taught her to doubt herself. She took a deep breath and began to play. Sarah's fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. Then she began to play. The first few notes emerged tentatively, slightly muffled by the piano's worn hammers. Someone in the audience stifled a laugh, but Sarah didn't stop. Her left hand found a rhythm, steady and sure, while her right began to explore a simple melody. The old piano responded grudgingly, its voice raspy with age and neglect. Yet even through its imperfections, something in the music commanded attention. Eleanor's perfectly composed expression faltered slightly. This wasn't the fumbling amateur performance she had expected. The melody grew more complex, Sarah's hands moving with increasing confidence. "Interesting approach," Eleanor said loudly, breaking the spell. "But perhaps something more conventional would better demonstrate your skills. A Chopinitude, perhaps?" Sarah paused, her fingers still resting on the keys. The interruption was deliberate, a tactic to throw her off balance. "I don't play Chopin," Sarah answered quietly. "No, not even a simple waltz?" Eleanor's tone was sweet poison. "Surely anyone claiming to be a pianist can manage that." The male judge shifted uncomfortably. "Eleanor, we should let her continue. I'm merely suggesting that Miss Miller demonstrate some basic proficiency with established repertoire," Eleanor interrupted. "Anyone can improvise random notes." The words were a slap. Sarah felt the room's energy shift as several audience members nodded in agreement. "Perhaps," Eleanor continued, rising from her seat and walking toward the old piano, "I could demonstrate what we're looking for." She gestured for Sarah to move, a queen dismissing a servant. Sarah stood, her legs wooden, as Eleanor took her place at the bench, adjusting it with a look of distaste. "This instrument is rather challenging," Eleanor said to the audience, playing a quick scale that revealed the piano's uneven tuning. But a true musician adapts. She began playing a Chopin nocturne, her technique polished and refined despite the piano's flaws. The message was clear, even on this inferior instrument. A real pianist could produce beauty. Eleanor played for exactly 2 minutes, just enough to make her point, then stopped and turned to Sarah. "That's the level of control we expect," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Now, would you like to try again with a proper piece, or shall we consider your audition complete?" Sarah felt heat rising to her face. The audience waited, most expecting her to admit defeat and flee. Even the sympathetic male judge was looking at his notes, avoiding her eyes. But something inside Sarah hardened. She had spent her life yielding space to people like Eleanor, people who believed talent belonged only to those with the right pedigree, the right teachers, the right background. "I'd like to continue," she said, "with my own piece." Eleanor's perfectly plucked eyebrows arched in surprise, but she relinquished the bench with a dismissive wave. "Very well," she said, "though I believe the committee has seen enough." Sarah resumed her seat, ignoring the murmurs rippling through the audience. Her hands settled on the keys, no hesitation this time, no uncertainty. She closed her eyes for just a moment, and when she opened them, something had changed in her demeanor. She began to play. The transformation was immediate and undeniable. What had started as a simple melody now expanded into something richer, deeper. Her left hand created complex rhythms that shouldn't have been possible for someone self-taught, while her right wove intricate patterns that danced above the bass line. The old piano seemed to awaken under her touch. Notes that had sounded dull moments before now rang with surprising clarity, as if the instrument itself was responding to her intentions rather than its physical limitations. In the audience, a white-haired man with thick glasses leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. A young woman stopped taking notes, her pen suspended above the page. Even the most skeptical observers fell silent, caught in the spell of what they were witnessing. Sarah's music told a story of struggle and perseverance, of beauty found in unexpected places. She incorporated elements of classical structure, but there were also hints of the jazz she'd absorbed as a child, harmonies that spoke of urban streets and late-night conversations. The composition built steadily, gathering momentum. Sarah's hands moved with fluid precision, her body swaying slightly as she gave herself to the music completely. A strand of hair fell across her face, but she didn't seem to notice. Eleanor's smile had frozen, calcified into something brittle. She glanced at her fellow judges. The woman was watching Sarah with undisguised wonder, and the man had removed his glasses, polishing them unnecessarily, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. When Sarah reached the climax of her piece, the music soared beyond the confines of the shabby upright, beyond the elegant recital hall, beyond the preconceptions that had filled the room minutes before. Every person present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, talent in its purest form, unfiltered by convention or expectation. As the final chord resonated through the room, Sarah's hands lifted gently from the keys. The sound lingered in the air, then faded to silence. Complete silence. For 5 long seconds, no one moved, no one spoke. The collective intake of breath remained suspended. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to applaud. The sound broke the spell, and suddenly the entire audience was on their feet. The applause thundered through the recital hall, growing stronger rather than fading. Several elderly patrons in the back row, donors who had witnessed performances by the world's greatest pianists, were the loudest, their faces alight with the joy of genuine discovery. Sarah remained seated at the piano, stunned by the response. This wasn't polite acknowledgement, it was recognition in its purest form. The male judge rose from his seat, still clapping. The younger female judge followed, her professional reserve cracking into a wide smile. Only Eleanor remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her expression rigid with disbelief. As the applause finally began to subside, the male judge spoke. "Miss Miller, that was—" He paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. "That was extraordinary, truly extraordinary." "The technical complexity alone," the female judge added, her voice carrying genuine admiration, "would challenge pianists with decades of formal training. Yet, your emotional expression, the narrative quality, that's something that can't be taught." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she finally stood. "Thank you," she said simply. "Where did you learn to play like that?" someone called from the audience. Sarah glanced toward the old piano, her companion in this unexpected triumph. "Life," she answered. "I learned from life." Eleanor finally rose, smoothing her immaculate suit jacket.